Hello, my name is Rick Reardon, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 1, dealing with theories of management. When we talk about management, and this deals with more management in general as opposed to strictly health information management, we have several theories. Theories are kind of guides to how we think things work. And in this chapter, we'll talk about the different theories. We'll talk about the impact of the different theories on management, on health information functions a little bit. We'll describe these theories. We'll list the key functions and skills of leadership. We'll talk about the differences between the different theories exhibited within healthcare organizations. And again, when we talk about management and leadership, managing, supervising, leading kind of gets into some murky areas. What's the difference between a manager and a leader? What's the difference between an employee and a subordinate? And so on. A term that we see often is the scientific management. And this is looking at management almost from a scientific basis. And some of the godfathers of scientific management were people like Frederick Taylor, Max Weber, the Gilbreths, and others. And they thought that management could be broken down into a science, almost like an industrial engineering type of assembly line type of thing. The administrative stuff talks about the hierarchy more. And people that we associate with that are people like Henry Foyle, James D. Mooney, Mary Parker Follett, and others. Humanistic management comes from the perspective that if we understand human behavior, then we can understand how to manage humans in the workplace, if you will. So some of the people that we hear about with that, one of the biggest ones that comes to mind is Abraham Maslow. If you've taken psychology, you can recall the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And this kind of ties in with some of Maslow's theories on you can't really self-actualize if you don't have your safety and basic needs met, and so on. In addition to Maslow, we have Elton Mayo, we have Douglas McGregor, and others. Operations management are basically looking at things solely from an operational standpoint with a focus on quality, efficiency, and the two terms that you'll see about a lot in healthcare are Six Sigma and lean management. And these are very, very big, especially in larger healthcare organizations like Kaiser Permanente, Sutter Health, and others. And when we say contemporary management, we talk about managing things by objectives. So in other words, if an organization has long-term goals, to reach those long-term goals, we have to have shorter-term objectives. And with the theory on managing by objectives in contemporary management, if we reach those objectives, we're much more likely to reach our goals. And of course, the king of management by objectives, of course, is Peter Drucker, and has written some great books on management by objectives, widely quoted in business journals, Wall Street Journal, even to this day. And again, what's the difference between leadership and management? Seems a little bit more nuanced. And again, when we think about leadership, we think about somebody, say, can inspire people, as opposed to somebody who's following up and hovering over people, making sure they do everything. And having read many management textbooks, one of the things we look at is the trait theory of leadership. In other words, people are born with these inherent traits, these genetic traits, if you will, that are associated with being great leaders. Not widely popular at this point, but there's still people that hold on to it. And there's more in terms of behavioral leadership. And so behavioral leadership is kind of looking at things from the perspective of we have a grid of behaviors, and the popular one that comes to mind is theory X and theory Y, right? X being, one perspective is that employees are lazy. They need to be kind of nose to the grindstone, close supervision, all this other type of thing. And the Y thinking, the opposite of that, of course, is thinking that people are naturally like to work, they like to be creative, they take pride in their work type of thing. Right. So that's kind of like looking at things from a behavioral standpoint. And then the contingencies, talking about what happens in terms of contingency. And this is a very realistic approach to leadership. If you think about it, in a crisis, whether it's World War II or an organization laying off, things tend to become much more top down. It's not a great deal of room for discussion, things like that. And then as the organization or the country or whatever it is gets into a safer place, they go into a more different type of behavioral or what have you approach. And this kind of moving back and forth on the continuum is kind of what we talk about with the situational leadership. And your book also talks about transformational versus transactional, pretty straightforward here. How we transform organizations, how organizations interact in terms of transactions. And then in terms of values-based leadership is talking about consistency and congruency with values of an individual and how they sit with the values that are part of the organization. And these kind of cascade down into individual team members, organization levels, and that's the value-based leadership. And that's all I have for you. Please contact me with any questions, or you're welcome to see me during office hours. Bye now.